Two fine priestly figures who were praying in the solitude of this country church for those who had fallen and were falling yonder under shot and shell. How I despised and upbraided myself at such moments! What a profound disgust I felt for the follies of my garrison life, its gross pleasures and silly excesses! I was ashamed of myself when I reflected that death brushed me by every day, and that I might disappear to day or to morrow, after so many ill-spent and unprofitable days. Without any effort, and almost in spite of myself, pious words came back to my lips, those words that my dear mother used to teach me on her knee years and years ago, and I felt quiet delight in the almost forgotten words that came back to me. Forgive us our trespasses. Pray for us, poor sinners. It seemed to me that I should presently go away a better man and a more valiant soldier. And, as though to encourage and bless me, a faint ray of sunshine came through the window. Ite missa est. The priest turned round, and at this time I thought his eyes rested upon me, and that look was a benediction and an absolution. But suddenly I heard in the alley close by a great noise of people running, and horses stamping, and voice crying, "Mount horses! Mount horses!" I was sorry to leave that little church of Pévy. I should so much have liked to wait until those two priests came out to speak to them, and talk about other things than war, massacres and pillage. But duty called me to my men, my horses, and to battle. Shortly afterwards, as I passed at the head of my troop in front of a large farm where the ambulance of the division was quartered, I saw my Abbé coming out of the barn, with his sleeves tucked up and his képi on the side of his head. He was carrying a large pail of milk. I recognised his clear look, and had no doubt that he recognised me too, for as our eyes met he gave me a kindly smile. My heart was lighter, and as I went forward my soul was calmer. For the last 6 days we had been quartered at Montigny-sur-Vesle, a pretty little village halfway up a hillside on the heights, 20 kilometres to the west of the Reims. There we enjoyed a little rest for the first time in the campaign. On our front the struggle was going on between the French and German trenches, and the employment of cavalry was impossible, for all the regiment had to do was to supply 2 daily troops required to ensure the connection between the 2 divisions of the army corps. What a happiness it was to be able at last to enjoy almost perfect rest! What a delight to lie down every evening in a good bed, not to get up before 7 o'clock, and to find our poor horses stabled at last on good litter in the barns, and to see them filling out daily and getting sleeker. For our mess we had the good luck to find a most charming and simple welcome at the house of the good Monsieur Cheveret. That kind old gentleman did everything in his power to supply us with all the comforts he could dispose of, and he did it all with such good grace and such a pleasant smile that we felt at ease and at home at once. Madame Cheveret, whom we at once called Maman Cheveret, was an alert little old lady who trotted about all day long in quest of things to do for us. She put us up in the dining-room and helped our cook to clean the vegetables and to superintend the joints and sweets. For Gosset, the bold chasseur appointed to preside over our mess arrangements, was a professional in the culinary art, and excelled in making everything out of nothing. So, with the help of Maman Cheveret, he accomplished wonders, and the result of it all was that we began to be enervated by the delights of this new Capua, and how thoroughly we enjoyed it. We shared our Eden with 2 other squadrons of our regiment, a section of an artillery park, and a divisional ambulance. We prayed Heaven to grant us a long stay in such a haven of repose. Now one morning, after countless ablutions with hot water and a clean shave, I was going, with brilliantly shining boots, down the steep footpath which led to the little house of our good Monsieur Cheveret, when my attention was drawn to a small white notice posted on the door of the church. It ran: "This evening, at 6 o'clock, Benediction of the Most Holy Sacrament." It occurred to me at once that this happy idea had been conceived by the chaplain of the ambulance, for until then the church had been kept locked, as the young parish priest had been called up by the mobilisation. I made haste to tell our captain and my comrades the good news, and we all determined to be present at the benediction that evening. At 5:30 our ears were delighted by music such as we had not been accustomed to hear for a very long time. In the deepening twilight some invisible hand was chiming the bells of the little church. How deliciously restful they were after the loud roar of the cannon and the rattle of the machine guns! Who would have thought that such deep and also such solemn notes could come from so small a steeple? It stirred the heart and brought tears to the eyes, like some of Chopin's music. These bells seemed to speak to us, and they seemed to call us to prayer and preach courage and virtue to us. At the end of the shady walk I was passing down, whose trees formed a rustling wall on either side, appeared the little church with its slender steeple. It stood out in clear relief, a dark blue, almost violet silhouette against the purple background made by the setting sun. Some dark human forms were moving about and collecting around the low arched doorway. Perhaps these were the good old women of the district who had come to pray in this little church which had remained closed to them for nearly 2 months. I fancied I could distinguish them from where I was, dignified and erect in their old-fashioned mantles. But as soon as I got closer to them, I found I was mistaken. It was not aged and pious women who were hurrying to the church door, but a group of silent artillerymen, wrapped in their large blue caped cloaks. The bells shook out some solemn notes, and seemed to be calling others to come too, and I should have been glad if their voices had been heard, for I was afraid the chaplain's appeal would hardly be heeded, and that the benches of the little church would be 3 parts empty. But, on gently pushing the door open, I found at once that my fears were baseless. The church was in fact too small to hold all the soldiers who had come long before the appointed hour, as soon as they had heard the bells begin. And now I had no fears about the church being empty. I wondered how I was going to find a place myself. I stood on the doorstep, undecided, on tiptoe, looking over the heads of all those standing men to see whether there was any corner unoccupied where I could enjoy the beauty of the unexpected sight in peace. The nave was almost dark. The expense of lighting had no doubt to be considered. For several days past no candle or taper was to be had for money, and no doubt the kindness of a motorist of the Red Cross had been appealed to for the supply of all the candles which lit up the altar. This was indeed resplendent. The vestry had been ransacked for candlesticks, and the tabernacle was surrounded by a splendid aureole of light. All this increased the touching impression I felt on entering. Against the brilliant background of the choir stood out the black forms of several hundreds of men standing looking towards the altar. Absolute silence reigned over the whole congregation of soldiers, and yet no discipline was enforced. There was no superior present to impose a show of devotion. Left to themselves, they all understood what they had to do. They crowded together, waiting in silence and without any impatience for the ceremony to begin. Suddenly a white figure came towards me through the crowded ranks of soldiers. He extended his arms in token of welcome, and I at once recognised the chaplain in his surplice. His face was beaming with pleasure, and his eyes shone behind his spectacles. He appeared to be supremely happy. "This way, Monsieur l'Officier. This way. I have thought of everything. You must have the seat of honour. Follow me." I followed the holy man, who elbowed a way for me up the crowded aisle. He had reserved all the choir stalls for the officers. Before the war they had been occupied at High Mass by the clergy, the choir, and the principal members of the congregation. He proudly showed me into one of them, and I felt rather embarrassed at finding myself suddenly in a blaze of light between an artillery lieutenant and a surgeon major. The low vestry door now opened, and a very unexpected procession appeared. In front of a bearded priest walked 4 artillerymen in uniform. One of them carried a censer, and another the incense box. The other 2 walked in front of them, arms crossed and eyes front. The whole procession knelt before the altar with perfect precision, and I saw beneath the priest's vestments muddy gaiters of the same kind as those worn by the gunners. At the same time we heard, quite close to us, strains of music which seemed to us celestial. In the dim light I had not noticed the harmonium, but now I could distinguish the artist who was enchanting us by his skill in drawing sweet sounds from a poor worn instrument. He was an artillery captain. At once all eyes were turned towards him. We were all enraptured. None of us dared to hope that we should lift our voices in the hymns. The organist seemed unconscious of his surroundings. The candle placed near the keyboard cast a strange light upon the most expressive of heads. Against the dark background of the church, the striking features of a noble face were thrown into strong relief. A forehead broad and refined, an aristocratic nose, a fair moustache turned up at the ends, and, notably, Two fine blue eyes